Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back, way back, into the frozen heart of 1700s Europe, where winter was not a season you complained about on social media while wrapped in a heated blanket. Winter was a living, breathing enemy. It had teeth. It had patience. And it came for poor families with a particular kind of cruelty that the wealthy, sitting in their stone manors with roaring fires and wine cellars, simply never had to reckon with. Tonight, you are not a nobleman. You are not a merchant with a warm second floor and a cook downstairs. Tonight, you are a peasant, a rural laborer, a category, a small craftsman on the edge of a village somewhere in France, Germany, England, or Poland, and the first frost has just arrived. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this in the way you're used to surviving things, like a bad Wi-Fi connection or a Monday morning. This is different. This is real. And it is relentlessly, beautifully, terrifyingly human. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I genuinely love knowing that someone in a warm bedroom in Manila or a chilly apartment in Stockholm is drifting off to this. It makes the whole thing feel like a campfire, and tonight we very much need one. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing outside your cottage, if you can call it that, somewhere in the rural lowlands of Central Europe, and the air has changed. It happened overnight, the way it always does. Yesterday there was still a faint memory of autumn warmth in the afternoon sun. You could feel it on your face if you stood in just the right spot, facing south, eyes closed, pretending for a moment that the cold was not already circling. But this morning you woke up and something was different. The smell of the air was sharper. Cleaner, in a way that sounds nice until you realize what that cleanliness costs. The mud outside your door, which has been your constant companion since October, has hardened overnight into ridged, unforgiving ground. The puddle near the animal pen has a thin skin of ice on it. And your breath comes out in small white clouds, one after another, like a series of quiet warnings. This is the 1700s. The Little Ice Age, which gripped Europe from roughly the 14th century onward and whose final bitter decades you are living through right now, has made winters across the continent noticeably harsher than anything people in the modern world experience as normal. Historians and climatologists have documented that average temperatures during this period were 1 to 2 degrees Celsius lower than pre-industrial baselines, which sounds small until you realize that 1 degree, held for months, is the difference between a river that slows and a river that freezes solid enough to drive a cart across. The Thames froze. The Seine froze. The canals of Amsterdam froze so reliably that entire markets were set up on the ice. For the wealthy, this was spectacle. For you, it is a countdown. You are, in the rough demographic terms of 18th century Europe, part of the vast majority. Somewhere between 60 and 80% of the European population during this era lived in rural poverty or near poverty, dependent on subsistence agriculture, seasonal labor, and whatever small trade their hands could produce. There is no safety net below you in any formal sense. No government heating assistance, no food bank 3 streets over, no emergency fund. What you have is your family, your neighbors, your animals, your store of autumn provisions, and the structure of the cottage behind you, which we will get to very soon, and which will simultaneously impress you with its ingenuity and horrify you with its conditions. But right now, in this opening moment, what matters is the feeling. Because winter in 1700s Europe was not merely a logistical challenge, it was a psychological season. It had a weight to it. You felt it arriving the way you feel a headache coming on, that slow, gathering pressure behind everything. The days had been shrinking for weeks. You noticed it in the fields, in the length of the afternoon, in how early the light went golden and then gray and then gone. The animals felt it too. The cow has been restless. The pig, which you have been fattening since August with a kind of grim affection, knowing what December holds, has been sleeping more, pressing itself into the corner of the pen where the straw is deepest. Your children, 3 of them, the youngest barely 2 years old, are still inside. You can hear them through the low door, a shuffling, a cough, the older one saying something to the younger one in that half-language siblings develop when adults aren't paying attention. Your partner is already working. There is always work. The fire needs feeding. The water needs fetching before the well gets any icier. The animals need checking. The thatch on the north-facing corner of the roof looked loose last week and you haven't fixed it yet, and every morning you wake up and it's the first thing you think about. This is your life. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not yet, anyway. Just the continuous, low-grade labor of staying alive inside a season that does not care about you in the slightest. And yet, somehow, and this is the thing that drew me to this story, the thing that keeps me here, you will probably make it. Not because the system supports you. Not because winter goes easy on the poor, but because human beings, when pressed against the cold hard wall of necessity, become astonishingly, almost absurdly resourceful. The strategies your family uses, the knowledge in your hands and your neighbor's hands, the rituals and workarounds and stubborn refusals to simply give up, that is what tonight is about. So pull the blanket up a little tighter, settle in, and let's follow you through it. Because winter, in all its brutal honesty, is just beginning. You turn back toward the cottage and look at it, really look at it, the way you don't normally, because when you live somewhere you stop seeing it and start simply inhabiting it. But let's see it clearly tonight, because this structure, humble and imperfect as it is the single most important piece of survival technology you own. It is not impressive by any standard that the modern eye would recognize. It is low, so low that a tall person ducks instinctively at the doorway, not because the door frame is decorative but because the entire building was constructed to minimize the volume of air that needed to be heated. Every inch of unnecessary ceiling height is an inch of cold air you'd have to warm with fuel you don't have. The builders of this cottage, likely your grandparents, or their grandparents, or a village carpenter working from accumulated generational knowledge, understood thermodynamics without ever having heard the word. The walls are the first thing to understand. In most of rural Europe during this period, the walls of a poor family's cottage were built from whatever the local landscape offered most cheaply and abundantly. In England and parts of northern France, this often meant cob, a mixture of clay, straw, sand, and sometimes animal dung, packed thick and allowed to dry into a surprisingly solid mass. In Central Europe and Scandinavia, timber framing was more common, with the gaps between the wooden beams stuffed with a mixture of moss, clay, straw, and horsehair, a technique called wattle and daub in its more refined form, though what you have is less refined and more desperate. In Poland and the eastern edges of the continent, full log construction was standard in forested areas, with the gaps between logs packed with anything fibrous and insulating, rags, dried leaves, animal wool pressed into service. The thickness of these walls matters enormously. A cob wall in a well-maintained English cottage could be 2 feet thick or more. 2 feet of dense, moisture-holding clay and straw mixture is a genuinely effective insulator, slow to lose heat, slow to admit cold, acting almost like a thermal battery that absorbs the warmth of the fire during the day and releases it slowly through the night. Historians who have studied vernacular architecture of this period have noted that many of these structures, despite their apparent primitiveness, performed comparably to early 20th century housing in terms of heat retention per unit of fuel consumed. That is not an accident. That is centuries of trial and error compressed into mud and straw. The floor beneath your feet is earth. Packed earth, worn smooth by generations of foot traffic, sometimes mixed with ox blood or clay to harden it, sometimes scattered with rushes or straw that you sweep out periodically and replace. It is not glamorous. It is cold in a way that rises through your feet even through thick wool stockings, a cold that is damp and bone-deep rather than crisp. In winter, you put down more straw. You put down every scrap of textile that isn't doing another job, old sacks, worn-out cloaks, pieces of sacking from the last grain delivery. The floor becomes a layered thing, a kind of rough carpet of accumulated insulation that you pick your way across carefully because you know which patches cover the worst cold spots. The roof is thatch, almost certainly thatch, because thatch was the roofing material of the European poor for centuries, and with good reason. A well-laid thatch roof, packed densely from base to ridge, is an extraordinary insulator. The trapped air within the straw acts as a thermal barrier. Rain runs off the outer angle. Snow, counterintuitively, is sometimes left to accumulate on a thatch roof in winter rather than being cleared, because a layer of snow functions as additional insulation, the same principle that igloos exploit, the same reason that animals burrow into snowbanks rather than away from them. You know this instinctively. You've watched your father leave the snow on the roof and you've never questioned it because you've felt the difference inside. The ceiling inside, if there is one, and in the simplest cottages there isn't, just the underside of the thatch, is low enough that the heat from the fire, which rises naturally, stays concentrated in the living space rather than escaping into an attic void. Many poor cottages had a sleeping loft accessed by a ladder, a raised platform just below the roofline where the family slept, and this positioning was deliberate. Heat rises. The loft was the warmest spot in the house. The floor was the coldest. You put the children in the loft. Windows, if your cottage has them at all, are small, almost aggressively small. A single opening, perhaps a foot wide and slightly taller, covered not with glass, which was expensive and fragile, but with oiled cloth, scraped animal hide, or wooden shutters that close tight against the cold. In some parts of northern Europe, bladders from pigs or sheep were stretched and dried to cover window openings, translucent enough to let in a dim gray light but solid enough to block the worst of the wind. In the coldest months, you keep the shutters closed almost all day. You live in a kind of voluntary dimness, trading light for warmth, and you do not find this tragic because you have never known anything else. The door is low and heavy and fits its frame imperfectly. There is almost always a gap somewhere, a thin whistle of cold air that comes through no matter how many rags you stuff into the crack. You have stuffed rags into that crack. You stuff new ones every November, pulling them out in spring, washing them if they're worth washing, discarding them if they're not. The door faces away from the prevailing wind whenever possible, a siting decision made when the cottage was first built that shapes your entire relationship with winter mornings. Scholars of early modern European domestic history still debate whether the design of peasant cottages reflected conscious architectural knowledge or simply accumulated habit passed down without formal understanding. The answer is probably both, and the distinction matters less than the outcome, which is that these structures, for all their discomfort and imperfection, were tuned to their environments in ways that kept people alive through winters that would genuinely kill an unprepared modern person within days. Your cottage is not cozy. But it is, in its rough and smoky and low-ceilinged way, exactly what it needs to be. The fire is never just a fire. You need to understand this before anything else about your winter life makes sense, because every decision you make from October through March, what you eat, when you sleep, how you organize your family's movements through the day, what you spend your last coins on, flows outward from the hearth the way water flows from a spring. It is the center of gravity of your entire existence. And right now, on this cold morning in the depths of a 1700s European winter, the first thing you did when you opened your eyes, before you checked on the children, before you thought about breakfast, before you registered the ache in your back from the straw mattress, was look at the fire. You looked to see if it was still alive. It is. Just barely. The embers from last night are still glowing under a layer of gray ash, a dull orange pulse that means you don't have to start from scratch. Starting from scratch is expensive in a way that has nothing to do with money. It costs time, it costs tinder, it costs the physical effort of coaxing a reluctant flame while your fingers are stiff with cold and your children are watching you with that particular expression children have when they're hungry and cold and too young to understand why the warmth isn't simply there yet. You lean forward and blow gently, long, slow, controlled breaths, and the embers brighten, and you feed the smallest, driest piece of kindling you have into the glow, and you wait, and eventually, with a small and deeply satisfying collapse of energy, the fire returns. This moment, the re-establishment of the fire, is so central to daily life in this period that it carried genuine emotional and spiritual weight. In many European folk traditions, the household fire was understood as a living presence, almost a member of the family, and allowing it to go out overnight was considered deeply inauspicious, even shameful. In parts of Scotland and Ireland, the practice of smouring, carefully banking the fire at night with ash to keep the embers alive until morning, was accompanied by prayers and specific ritual phrases, treating the preservation of fire as something sacred. In the context of 1700s poor households across Europe, this attitude was not mere superstition. It was accurate. The fire was alive. And keeping it alive was a matter of survival. The hearth in your cottage is open, a stone or brick construction built into one wall or, in older structures, positioned centrally in the room with a hole in the roof above it to let the smoke escape. The chimney, if you have one, is a relatively recent addition to poor housing. Many rural cottages of the early 1700s still relied on the older open hearth system, which meant that smoke filled the upper portion of the room before finding its way out through a smoke hole or a small louvered opening in the gable. This sounds miserable and in many ways it is. Your eyes water in the mornings, you cough more than you would in clean air, the underside of the thatch is permanently black with soot. But the smoke has a side effect that you've never analyzed but have simply accepted as part of how life works: it preserves the thatch. The tars in would smoke coat the straw from the inside, making it resistant to rot and to insects. The very discomfort of living in a smoky space extends the life of your roof. Everything about this cottage is a trade-off. Fuel is your most precious winter resource, and the management of it requires a kind of ongoing arithmetic that runs quietly in the back of your mind from the moment autumn begins. Wood is the primary fuel across most of Europe, but access to wood is far from simple for the rural poor. Forests are owned, by lords, by the church, by the village commons in more fortunate communities, and the right to collect wood is carefully controlled. You are entitled, in most cases, to collect dead wood from the ground, fallen branches, the kind of material that a lord's woodkeeper has not claimed. Live wood, the cutting of standing trees, requires permission, payment, or sufficiently discreet behavior after dark. Historians have documented an enormous body of law across 18th-century Europe specifically regulating access to forest resources, and the consistent violation of those laws by the rural poor, which tells you something important about the gap between what was legally available and what was actually necessary to survive. So your woodpile, the stack against the sheltered side of the cottage, covered with a piece of old canvas or a salvaged plank, represents weeks of accumulated labor. You started gathering in late summer. You carried armloads home from the forest margins, stacked them to dry, covered them against the autumn rain. You know, with the rough mental math of long practice, approximately how many days of heat that pile represents. You also know it's probably not enough. It never quite is. This is why fire management, the careful regulation of how much you burn and when, becomes a constant background skill in winter life. You do not keep the fire roaring all day. A roaring fire is a wealthy household's fire, a fire that someone else is feeding, a fire you don't have to worry about in the morning. Your fire is modest, deliberately modest. You build it up in the mornings for cooking and warmth, let it settle to a steady medium burn through the day while work happens around it, and then in the evening you begin the careful process of reducing it, feeding it less, letting it drop to the minimum that will still heat the room and protect the children from the worst cold, before banking it at night with ash to preserve the core. Peat, where it was available, in Ireland, Scotland, parts of the Low Countries and northern Germany, was used instead of or alongside wood, and it had its own economics and rituals. Peat burns slower and cooler than wood but lasts longer and was often free to cut from common bogs. Families who had access to peat rights were in a meaningfully better position than those who didn't. Some communities burned dried animal dung, a fuel source that sounds humiliating but is entirely practical, burned steadily, and was used across Europe and Asia for centuries without apology. The quirky footnote to all of this is that in some parts of 18th century France, city authorities actually tracked fire usage in poor neighborhoods during severe cold snaps by monitoring rooftop smoke. If a chimney went cold for too long, it was sometimes interpreted as a sign that the household was in distress. It was, in its rough way, an early welfare check. The smoke meant you were alive. And every morning when you blew those embers back to life, you were, without quite knowing it, announcing your survival to the world. There is a smell in your cottage that you have stopped noticing entirely, the way you stop noticing the sound of a river if you live beside it long enough. A visitor, someone from a town, someone with the luxury of separate structures for separate purposes, would step through your low doorway and recoil slightly, their nostrils registering something dense and warm and biological that sits somewhere between a stable and a bakery and a den of large sleeping animals. You would look at them with mild confusion, because to you this smell is simply the smell of home in winter. It is the smell of survival. And the creatures producing most of it are standing 3 feet away from where your children sleep, separated from the family's living space by nothing more than a low wooden partition or, in the simplest cases, nothing at all. This is the byre house, the longhouse, the combined dwelling, and it was standard across enormous swaths of rural Europe during this period. The practice of housing humans and animals under one roof, or in directly adjoining structures sharing a common wall through which heat could pass, was not a sign of desperation or ignorance. It was a rational, well-tested response to the thermal mathematics of winter survival. A single cow produces approximately the same heat output as a small space heater, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 watts of continuous warmth, generated by the metabolic processes of a large mammal that is simply existing, eating, and breathing. You are not heating the cow. The cow is heating you. The relationship is one of the more elegant arrangements in the history of human ingenuity, even if it is not something you would choose to explain to modern dinner party guests. The typical arrangement in a northern European longhouse of this era placed the family's living space at one end and the animal quarters at the other, with the animals situated on the slightly lower end so that drainage ran away from the living area rather than toward it. The shared wall between the two spaces was often just a rough wooden barrier, enough to prevent the pig from wandering into the sleeping area at 2 in the morning but not enough to block the slow, steady seepage of animal body heat into the human side of the building. On the coldest nights, the nights when the temperature outside dropped well below freezing and the wind came sideways across the fields, this seepage was the difference between dangerous cold and merely uncomfortable cold. The animals you might share your winter with depended on what your family could afford to keep and feed through the lean months. A cow was the most valuable, both for her heat output and for the milk she might still produce in reduced quantities through winter, a source of fat and calories that the family genuinely needed. A pig, usually 1, sometimes 2, fattened through the autumn and slaughtered in December in the great annual event that every rural family organized their late autumn calendar around. A few sheep or goats, whose wool was as valuable as their warmth and whose milk added variety to the diet. Chickens, almost universally, because chickens are small and hardy and will wedge themselves into any warm corner available, and their scratching and murmuring in the dark is a sound so deeply embedded in the human experience of pre-industrial domestic life that it appears in descriptions of peasant households from Sweden to Sicily. The chickens, in many households, came entirely indoors in winter. They roost on the rafters, on the furniture, on the edge of the sleeping loft ladder. They produced eggs, which were precious, and warmth, which was nearly as precious, and a certain amount of mess that you cleaned up with the philosophical resignation of someone who has long since made peace with the non-negotiable terms of their existence. Historians studying the material culture of 18th-century European peasant life have found consistent archaeological and documentary evidence of human-animal cohabitation across France, the Germanic states, Scandinavia, the British Isles, and Eastern Europe, not as an aberration but as the norm, the baseline, the expected configuration of a poor family's winter. The smell we should discuss honestly, because it mattered in ways beyond the olfactory. Animal waste, the manure that accumulated on the animal side of the longhouse through winter, was a resource, not merely a problem. It was carefully collected and composted, either in a pile adjacent to the building or in a covered pit, and in spring it became the fertilizer that your fields depended on. Some households in northern France and the Low Countries maintained what were called fumiers, manure heaps positioned directly against the exterior wall of the house, and the heat generated by the composting process provided an additional layer of insulation to the wall it was piled against. This is the kind of detail that sounds either disgusting or brilliant depending on how charitable you're feeling, and the honest answer is that it was both simultaneously. The animals also required care through the night, which shaped the family's sleeping patterns in ways we'll come back to in more detail later. Someone had to check on the cow, particularly in the deepest cold. A sick animal was not merely a loss of future food, it was a loss of current heat, and a dead animal in the night could mean the family woke to a significantly colder space than they'd gone to sleep in. Children, particularly older children who had aged into usefulness, were sometimes given the responsibility of night-checking the animals, a job that required getting up, crossing the partition, feeling for warmth and the steady rise and fall of a large breathing side, and then returning to the sleeping pile satisfied. There is a charming and somewhat improbable footnote from the historical record of 18th-century Bavaria, where tax assessors attempting to count livestock for purposes of agricultural taxation occasionally reported that they could not reliably distinguish between the household and the animal quarters because the family's sleeping arrangements had expanded organically into the animal space during a cold snap, with children bedded down in the straw beside the cow on the grounds that she was warmer than the loft. The assessors noted this without apparent judgment. It was simply what people did. Historians still argue whether the health consequences of human-animal cohabitation were on balance negative, given the disease transmission risks, or partially offset by the thermal and nutritional benefits in the context of a population that would otherwise have faced higher cold-related mortality. The debate is unresolved. What is not debated is that millions of European families made this calculation every winter and chose warmth, and that most of them survived to make it again the following year. The hunger season does not begin in winter. This is the thing that catches most people off guard when they first start thinking seriously about how pre-industrial European families survived the cold months, the assumption that winter is when the crisis starts, when the scarcity arrives, when the planning begins. But you have known since childhood that by the time the first frost comes, the decisions that will determine whether your family eats adequately or desperately between now and April have already been made. The hunger season begins in autumn, in the frantic, exhausting, every hour of daylight weeks between harvest and first freeze, when your hands are never clean and your back never fully straightens and the entire logic of your year converges into a single urgent question: do you have enough? The answer, in most years, for most poor families in 1700s Europe, was, probably. Not comfortably. Not generously. But probably enough, if you were careful, if the winter wasn't too long, if nobody got seriously sick, if the pig survived until December, if the grain you stored stayed dry, if the root vegetables in the cellar didn't rot, if the neighbors didn't need too much help and you didn't need too much from them. Probably enough is what you worked toward from the first warm day of spring through the last harvest day of autumn, and probably enough is what you went to sleep praying for on the night the first real cold arrived. Food preservation was not a hobby or a lifestyle choice in 18th-century rural Europe. It was the primary intellectual and physical project of every household from approximately August through November, and the techniques involved represented centuries of accumulated knowledge that was passed from mother to daughter, from father to son, from neighbor to neighbor with the kind of casual thoroughness that only comes when the stakes are genuinely mortal. You knew how to salt meat because your mother taught you and her mother taught her, and somewhere back in the chain someone learned the hard way what happened when you didn't use enough salt. You knew how to dry herbs and roots because the alternative was scurvy and night blindness and the slow, grinding malnutrition that made winter illness so much more likely to kill. The pig slaughter, usually in late November or December, often around the feast of St. Martin on the 11th of November in Catholic communities, a date that functioned as an informal starting gun for the winter food preparation season, was the single most important food event of the year for a poor family. Everything was used. This was not a philosophical position about waste reduction, it was simple arithmetic. The meat was salted and packed into barrels or hung in the chimney to smoke. The fat was rendered into lard, which was both cooking fat and, in desperate times, something that could be spread on bread as a calorie source when everything else ran low. The intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings. The blood was cooked into black pudding. The bones were boiled for broth and then given to the dog or cracked for marrow. The bladder, as we briefly touched on earlier, had its own household applications. A pig that went into the slaughter weighing 200 pounds came out of it as almost nothing wasted, because nothing could be wasted. Salt was the other great preservative, and access to it was a genuine economic pressure point for poor families across Europe. Salt taxes, the gabelle in France being the most notorious, drove up the price of one of the most basic survival necessities and created a persistent, low-level crisis in the food security of the rural poor. The gabelle was so deeply resented that it became one of the specific grievances cited in the lead-up to the French Revolution, which tells you something about how central salt was to daily survival and how viscerally people felt its artificial scarcity. You needed salt to preserve your meat, your fish if you lived near water or a trading route, your butter, your vegetables. Without adequate salt your winter food supply shrank dramatically, and the calculation of how much salt you could afford to buy in autumn was one that determined how much protein your family would have in February. Root vegetables went into the root cellar, a pit dug below the frost line, either beneath the cottage floor or in the ground outside, lined with straw and covered to maintain the near-freezing but not frozen temperature that kept carrots, turnips, parsnips, and beets in a state of suspended usefulness for months. The root cellar was checked regularly because rot was contagious. One soft turnip pressed against its neighbors could compromise an entire season's supply in a week, and you learned to sort through the pile with your hands in the dark, feeling for the give of decay, pulling out anything questionable before it spread. Grains, rye, barley, oats, occasionally wheat if you were prosperous enough or lucky enough in your harvest, were stored in sacks or wooden chests, elevated off the floor to avoid damp, in the driest part of the cottage or in a separate small granary if the family had one. The mental ledger that you kept, rough, intuitive, updated daily, tracked how your supplies were holding against how far the winter still had to run. You knew, from long experience and community knowledge, approximately how many weeks of serious cold you could expect in your region. You knew your family's consumption rates with the rough precision of someone who has never had the luxury of imprecision. And you knew the warning signs, the point at which the sacks felt too light, the point at which the cellar was giving up its last reserves, that told you it was time to start reducing portions before the reduction was forced on you by emptiness. Historians still argue whether chronic mild malnutrition was the universal baseline condition of the European rural poor in winter, or whether sufficient years of good harvest and careful management could produce genuine food security at the household level. The evidence suggests enormous variation. Good years and bad years, well-managed households and desperate ones, regions with better access to common resources and regions stripped bare by taxation and landlord extraction. What is consistent across the documentary record is the anxiety, the planning, the autumn urgency that never quite left you until the first green things appeared in spring and told you that the hunger season, at least for this year, was finally, mercifully ending. You are hungry in a way that is not dramatic. This is important to understand, because when we imagine historical hunger we tend to reach for the extreme images, the hollow cheeks, the distended bellies, the crisis moments that make it into the written record precisely because they were extraordinary. But the hunger that defines your winter is not that. It is quieter and more persistent than that. It is the hunger of someone who has eaten, technically, but not quite enough, who has consumed calories but not quite sufficient calories, who has had something warm in the stomach but not quite the warmth that reaches all the way to the edges of the body. It is the hunger of slightly reduced portions, of broth that is thinner than it was in October, of bread that is darker and denser and less of it than you would choose if choosing were the point. This is your winter diet, and you have eaten some version of it every winter of your life, and you will eat it again, and you are remarkably, stubbornly, ingeniously good at making it work. The cornerstone of your winter eating is pottage, and if you have never heard the word before, file it away, because it was the single most important food in the diet of the European poor for several centuries and it deserves more respect than history typically gives it. Pottage is, at its most basic, a thick soup or porridge made by boiling grains or legumes in water until they break down into a dense, filling mass, with whatever vegetables, herbs, or scraps of meat or fat can be added to improve the flavor and nutritional content. It is endlessly variable within its essential simplicity. In a good week your pottage has a piece of salt pork in it, some dried peas, a turnip pulled from the cellar, a handful of dried herbs that you gathered in summer and hung from the rafters to dry. In a harder week it is grain and water and whatever fat you can spare, thick enough to be filling, plain enough to remind you that this is the lean time. The pot hangs over your fire almost continuously. This is not an exaggeration. The cooking pot, suspended from an iron hook or a wooden crane over the hearth, was in many poor households a permanent feature of the fire, replenished and refreshed rather than emptied and started from scratch. You added to it. You drew from it. The contents shifted gradually over days, new ingredients incorporated into what remained from the previous cooking, the pot becoming a kind of slow, accumulating record of the week's available resources. This continuous cooking method was efficient in ways that matter enormously when fuel is scarce. You were not repeatedly bringing a cold pot to a boil, which costs fuel, but maintaining an already hot liquid at a steady simmer, which costs significantly less. The pot was also your hot water source, your warming vessel, the thing that made the cottage smell like something other than cold air and animal. Bread, where grain was available, was the other daily staple, and the bread you eat in winter is not the bread of summer abundance. Winter bread in a poor 18th century household was typically made from rye, darker, denser, more acidic than wheat bread, with a shelf life that wheat bread couldn't match and a nutritional profile that, while not glamorous, provided meaningful sustenance. In the leanest periods, rye flour was stretched with other things, dried peas ground into flour, bran, occasionally bark flour in the most desperate northern communities where winter starvation was a genuine recurring threat. The resulting bread was heavy and dark and not particularly pleasant, but it filled the stomach and it lasted, which were the two requirements that mattered. The salt meat from your November pig slaughter is being rationed with a care that borders on the ceremonial. A piece of salt pork the size of your fist might flavor a week's worth of pottage, imparting fat and protein and the deeply satisfying savory quality that makes a plain grain porridge feel like a meal rather than a punishment. You are not eating the meat directly, not yet, not unless it's a feast day or someone is sick and needs the nutrition. You are using it as a flavoring agent, a cook's trick that stretches a finite resource across the maximum possible number of meals. The fat that renders out of it into the cooking liquid is as valuable as the meat itself, because fat is calories and calories are heat and heat is survival. Fish, where accessible, was a crucial supplement to the winter diet of the poor, and the Catholic Church's calendar of fast days, on which meat was prohibited but fish was permitted, had the unintended side effect of building fish consumption into the rhythm of the week for communities across Europe. Dried salt cod, herring packed in barrels, smoked fish of various kinds, these were trade goods that even relatively poor households could sometimes access, and they provided protein and variety in a diet that could otherwise become monotonously grain-centered. The herring trade in particular was an enormous economic force in 18th century Europe, connecting the fishing grounds of the North Sea to the tables of poor families across France, Germany, and the Low Countries through a distribution network that was, by the standards of the era, remarkably efficient. There is a genuinely surprising footnote in the dietary history of this period. Researchers studying the bones of 18th century European peasants have found evidence that seasonal variation in diet was so pronounced that the chemical composition of bones actually shifted measurably between the well-fed summer months and the lean winter ones, a record written in calcium and collagen of exactly how much the body was asked to give up between November and April. Your skeleton, if anyone were to study it 300 years from now, would tell the story of every winter you survived in the quiet language of mineral depletion and recovery. Foraging supplemented the stored supplies in ways that required knowledge and timing. Dried mushrooms gathered in autumn and stored, dried berries, nuts collected from common woodland margins, rose hips that persisted on the brambles into early winter and provided vitamin C in a diet chronically short of fresh produce. You knew your local landscape the way a modern person knows their neighborhood, intimately, specifically, with a mental map of every productive patch and every seasonal offering. This knowledge was not romantic. It was practical to the point of being mundane. And it kept you, on many winter days, just barely on the right side of enough. You have not been warm since October. Not properly, fully, all the way through warm, the kind of warm that reaches your shoulder blades and your shins and the tips of your fingers and stays there without requiring constant maintenance. That kind of warmth is a memory from summer, a physical state so distant by mid-January that you have almost stopped thinking of it as the default and started thinking of it as the exception. Cold is your baseline now. Cold is the water you swim in. And your clothing, every layer of it, every repaired and re-repaired and re-repaired piece of textile that you own, is your constant negotiation with that baseline, your daily argument with a season that would very much like to win. The first thing to understand about the clothing of the 18th century European poor is that there was very little of it, and what existed was never wasted, never discarded, never allowed to simply wear out without being converted into something else. A garment in your household had a life cycle that a modern fast fashion item could not even comprehend. A woolen coat began its life as a coat, was worn until it was no longer coatable, was then cut down into a child's garment, was then cut down further into patches, was then used as stuffing or lining, was then used as floor covering, was then, in its final and most degraded form, twisted into rope or stuffed into the crack under the door where the cold comes through. Nothing stopped being useful until it had absolutely no remaining structural integrity. Even then the fibers might be picked apart and reused in some form, carted back into raw material for respinning if anyone had the time and energy, which in winter was sometimes the case because winter evenings were long and hands needed occupation and spinning was something you could do by firelight. Wool was your primary textile and your primary defense against cold, and the relationship between poor rural families and wool in 18th century Europe was intimate in the way that relationships with life-sustaining things tend to be. If your family kept sheep, even 1 or 2 sheep, you were involved in every stage of the wool's journey from fleece to fabric. Shearing in spring, washing, carding, spinning into yarn on the drop spindle or the spinning wheel if you had one, weaving or knitting into finished fabric. The quality of what the rural poor produced at home was generally coarser and less refined than commercial wool cloth, but coarse wool is still wool, still lanolin-rich, still naturally water-resistant to a degree, still one of the best insulating materials available in a pre-synthetic world because of its ability to trap air within its crimped fibers and retain warmth even when damp, which was a genuinely critical property in a climate where dampness was a constant companion. Your winter clothing strategy, to the extent that it was a conscious strategy rather than simply the accumulated layering of everything you owned, was built on the principle of layers. Not because you had read about thermal regulation, you hadn't, the concept didn't exist in those terms, but because you had lived in a cold body long enough to understand empirically that 2 thinner layers were warmer than 1 thick layer, that the air trapped between fabrics was doing work, that putting on everything you owned when you went outside and then removing the outer layers when you came back to the fire was the most efficient way to manage your body temperature across a day of varying activity levels. You knew this the way you knew everything practical, through your body, through experience, through watching what worked and what didn't over years of winters. The base layer, against your skin, was a linen shirt or shift, linen rather than wool because linen, despite being a poorer insulator, was easier to wash and less irritating against skin worn down by the friction of physical labor. Over this came whatever wool you had, a heavy tunic or gown in various regional styles, a bodice or doublet depending on gender and local fashion, heavy wool stockings that came up to the knee or above and were knitted rather than woven, dense enough that they functioned almost as a second skin over your lower legs. On top of all of this, in the coldest weather, came the outer layer, a heavy cloak if you were lucky enough to own one, a blanket repurposed as a wrap if you weren't, an old grain sack with a hole cut for the head in the most desperate cases, which sounds like a joke but appears with uncomfortable frequency in the documentary record of 18th century poor relief applications, people describing their winter outer garments in terms that make modern reading uncomfortable. The feet deserve special attention because cold feet were not merely uncomfortable, they were a genuine medical threat in a world where frostbite led to infection led to amputation or death in the absence of effective treatment. Wooden clogs were the standard footwear of the rural poor across much of northern and central Europe, and they were better suited to this purpose than their appearance suggests. A wooden sole does not conduct cold the way leather does. Clogs were typically worn with thick wool stockings and often stuffed with straw, packed around the foot inside the clog, which added insulation and absorbed moisture and was replaced when it became too wet and compressed to be useful. The image of a peasant pulling straw out of their shoes to renew the insulation is not picturesque rural charm. It is functional engineering. Historians still argue about the extent to which the clothing poverty of the rural poor in this era contributed directly to cold-related mortality, versus the extent to which acclimatization and adaptive behavior compensated for textile scarcity. One particularly interesting area of scholarly debate involves the use of animal skins by the very poorest, sheepskin with the wool still attached, worn as a vest or wrapped around the torso, which appears in poor relief records and traveler accounts but is difficult to quantify as a widespread practice. What is clear is that the ingenuity applied to staying clothed and covered in winter was on a par with the ingenuity applied to staying fed and housed, relentless, practical, and entirely born of necessity rather than choice. Hats, it is worth noting, were not optional. Heat loss from an uncovered head in serious cold is not a myth, it is physiology. Every person in your household wore something on their head from November through March, from the simplest knitted wool cap to a wrapped cloth to, for the children, whatever could be tied under the chin and kept on despite small children's apparent evolutionary drive to remove headwear at the worst possible moments. The baby has been crying since before dawn. Not the sharp, alarmed cry of something suddenly wrong, but the low, persistent, miserable cry of a small body that is cold and hungry and not yet possessed of the language to explain which of these things is bothering it most or in what proportion. You know this cry. You have heard it every winter morning since the child arrived, and you know what it requires: warmth, first, immediately, because a cold infant is a dangerous infant, and then feeding, and then the particular kind of sustained physical contact that small children require in cold weather in a way that feels almost more urgent than in summer, as though their bodies understand instinctively that another warm body is a resource and they are going to hold on to it with both fists. Children in 18th century Europe died at rates that are genuinely difficult for the modern mind to absorb without a kind of protective numbness settling over the statistics. Infant mortality, deaths in the first year of life, ran at somewhere between 150 and 300 per thousand live births across most of Europe during this period, depending on region, decade, and social class. For the rural poor, the numbers tended toward the higher end. Winter compressed this mortality into its worst months. January, February, and March were the deadliest for infants and young children across virtually every European region for which records survive, a pattern so consistent that demographers have given it a name, the winter mortality peak, and have traced it through parish records stretching back centuries. The causes were overlapping and mutually reinforcing. Respiratory infections that a well-nourished, warm child might have survived were fatal in a cold, malnourished one. Diarrheal illnesses caused by the limited and sometimes contaminated winter diet stripped small bodies of fluids and nutrients they couldn't afford to lose, and the simple physiological fact that infants cannot regulate their own body temperature the way adults can made exposure a constant, low-grade threat. You know all of this without knowing any of it in these terms. You know it in the way that generations of child loss have shaped the practices and anxieties of every family around you, in the extra layer you always put on the baby even when it seems like too much, in the way you check breathing in the night more often than seems rational, in the particular alertness that parents in this era maintained around small children through the winter months that reads, in the historical record, less like paranoia and more like appropriate threat assessment. The swaddling of infants was a near-universal practice across 18th century Europe, and while it has attracted significant criticism from modern child development perspectives, its thermal logic in the context of a cold cottage was real. A tightly swaddled infant loses heat more slowly than an unswaddled one. The wrapping traps a layer of warm air against the body, limits the surface area exposed to cold air, and prevents the flailing movements that accelerate heat loss in small limbs. Swaddling bands were typically wool, wound firmly but not damagingly tight, starting from the feet and working upward, producing a neat, cylindrical package that could be tucked into a cradle, hung near the fire on a hook specifically designed for this purpose, or handed off to an older sibling or neighbor to hold without the risk of dropping. Whether the practice was good for infant development in the broader sense is a question historians and pediatricians still engage with. Whether it kept cold babies warmer is not really in question. The cradle itself was almost always positioned as close to the fire as safety allowed, close enough for warmth, far enough that sparks were not a threat, a distance calibrated by the experienced eye of someone who had made this calculation before and would make it again every winter morning. In some households the cradle was suspended on ropes from the ceiling beams, allowing it to be rocked by a foot while the rocker's hands remained free for other work, a piece of functional furniture design that solved simultaneously the problem of keeping the infant moving and soothed and the problem of never having enough hands for everything that needed doing. Older children, those past infancy, past the most acute zone of vulnerability, presented a different set of challenges in winter. Children between roughly 2 and 8 years old were old enough to move independently but not old enough to be reliably careful about cold, fire, or any of the other winter hazards that a cottage full of survival infrastructure presented. The open hearth was the obvious danger, burns were common, and the treatment available for serious burns in a rural 18th century household was limited enough that what would now be a treatable injury was then frequently a death sentence through infection. Children were kept away from the fire by a combination of instruction, physical barriers, a wooden screen or a ring of heavy objects placed around the hearth, and the watchfulness of whoever was inside during the day, which was usually the mother or an older daughter. The older children, those 10 and above, were already part of the household's survival labor force in ways that had real winter significance. Fetching wood. Tending animals. Carrying water before the ice on the well got too thick. Watching younger siblings while adults did heavier work. Spinning by firelight in the evenings, a task small hands could manage and one that produced actual material value. In a family economy where every capable body was a resource, children became capable earlier than modern sensibility is comfortable with, and winter accelerated this transition because winter left no slack in the system for anyone to simply be present without contributing. There is a poignant footnote in the records of 18th century French parish registers, priests noting, in their careful Latin columns of births and deaths, the particular frequency with which children died in the coldest weeks of February and March, sometimes adding brief marginal comments that translate roughly as, taken by the cold, or, the winter took another. These were not formal medical diagnoses. They were a community's way of acknowledging, in the sparse language available to them, that winter was doing what winter did, pressing hardest on the smallest and most vulnerable, taking what the season demanded, leaving the survivors to carry the memory forward into spring. You did not survive this winter alone. This is the truth that sits underneath every other truth about poor family survival in 1700s Europe, the foundation that makes all the individual strategies, the careful fire management, the ration salt pork, the swaddled baby by the hearth, actually viable rather than merely heroic in isolation. Human beings are not well designed for solitary survival in serious cold. We are too naked, too slow, too dependent on complex food preparation, too vulnerable in sleep, too liable to the cascading failures that follow a single bad event, a broken tool, a sick animal, an injury, to make it through a northern European winter on the resources of a single household without any external support. The village was not a backdrop to your survival. The village was a mechanism of your survival, as functional and as carefully maintained as the thatch on your roof or the embers in your hearth. The mutual aid networks of 18th-century rural European communities operated without formal organization in most cases, without written agreements, without designated administrators, without the institutional apparatus that modern social welfare requires. They operated instead on the basis of reciprocity so deeply embedded in community life that it functioned almost like a reflex. You helped your neighbor because your neighbor had helped you, because your neighbor would help you again, because the entire community understood at a level below conscious articulation that the alternative to mutual support was a higher rate of death among people you knew and needed and cared about. The economics of this were not abstract. They were immediate, personal, and enforced by the social pressure of a community small enough that everyone knew everyone's business and long memories were the rule rather than the exception. The most visible form of winter mutual aid was the sharing of fire and food in moments of acute crisis. If a household's fire went out and they could not restart it, perhaps their tinder was wet, perhaps the flint was lost, perhaps illness had left everyone too weak to manage the process, a neighbor would bring live coals in a clay pot, a practice so standard that it barely warranted comment in the documentary record, appearing only when something unusual attached to it. If a family's food stores ran short before spring, neighbors provided, not lavishly, not from abundance, but from their own carefully rationed supplies, accepting the social debt that this created and the expectation that it would be repaid in kind when circumstances reversed. These transfers were not charity in the sense of a gift freely given with no expectation of return. They were loans against future reciprocity, investments in the community's collective survival capacity. The communal sharing of labor was the other great pillar of winter survival networks. Wood cutting, which required more physical effort than a single person or household could efficiently manage alone, was frequently done communally, groups of men from neighboring households going out together to the common woodland margins, cutting and hauling together, sharing the load and the risk. The communal barn raising of spring and summer had its winter equivalent in the collective management of shared resources, clearing snow from shared paths, maintaining communal wells, watching over the livestock of a household struck by illness. These were not organized events with advanced scheduling. They were responses, immediate and practical, to needs that the community recognized as collective rather than individual. The guild system, in towns and larger villages, provided a more formalized layer of mutual support for craft workers and artisans, weavers, blacksmiths, carpenters, leather workers, whose winter income dropped along with agricultural work. Guild charity funds, maintained by member contributions during prosperous times, provided relief payments to members who fell into destitution through illness, injury, or market collapse. The records of these funds from 18th-century France and the Germanic states show consistent winter spikes in relief applications, the cold season reliably producing the concentrations of need that the funds were designed to address. Not everyone had access to guild support, and the rural agricultural poor who made up the majority of the population largely did not, but for the artisan class it represented a genuine institutional buffer against the worst outcomes. The church was the other major formal institution in this picture, and its role in winter survival was simultaneously spiritual and thoroughly practical. Parish poor boxes, collections taken during services and distributed to the most desperate households, functioned as a rudimentary welfare transfer in most European communities. Church granaries, maintained in better endowed parishes, provided grain relief in famine years. Monasteries and convents operated as distribution points for food, firewood, and basic clothing to the local poor, a function so embedded in monastic life that the records of major religious houses include detailed accounts of winter charitable distributions stretching back to the medieval period. The effectiveness of church relief varied enormously depending on the wealth of the local institution, the character of its leadership, and the severity of the need in any given year. In a bad year, the church could not come close to meeting the demand, and its resources were themselves strained by the same harvest failures that produced the need. Historians still argue about the relative importance of formal institutional relief versus informal community mutual aid in sustaining poor populations through difficult winters, whether the church and guild systems were structurally significant or merely symbolic gestures against needs so vast that they couldn't meaningfully address it. The emerging consensus in early modern social history leans toward the informal networks as the primary survival mechanism, with formal institutions providing important but ultimately supplementary support. What both agree on is that the individual household, operating in isolation, was genuinely insufficient, that survival was a collective project in ways that modern individualist cultures struggle to fully internalize. There is something quietly profound about this when you sit with it on a cold night. Your survival was not a personal achievement. It was a communal one, woven from 10,000 small acts of reciprocity between people who needed each other with a directness and an honesty that abundance tends to obscure. The neighbor who brought coals when your fire went out was not being generous in the way we use that word now, implying a surplus freely shared. They were being human in the oldest sense, recognizing that your survival and theirs were not separate projects but the same one, pursued together or not at all. The cold does not cancel the work. This is perhaps the cruelest truth of winter in 1700s Europe for the rural poor, the one that most sharply distinguishes your experience from the modern fantasy of winter as a season of rest and hibernation and warm drinks by the window. You do not get to hibernate. The animals need feeding every single day regardless of temperature. The fire needs fuel regardless of how much your hands hurt in the cold. The water needs fetching regardless of how thick the ice on the well has grown overnight. The paths need clearing regardless of how much snow fell while you slept. Winter does not reduce your labor obligations in any meaningful sense, it increases them, because every basic task becomes harder, slower, more physically punishing, and more dangerous when the temperature is below freezing and the ground is treacherous and your body is running on less food than it needs to perform optimally. You are outside before full light this morning. This is not a choice so much as a constraint. The animals cannot wait for the sun, and the well is easier to manage before the day's activity freezes the rope mechanism into something that requires 10 minutes of patient coaxing before it will move. Your breath comes in rapid clouds as you cross the yard, your clogs crunching on the frozen mud, your outer wrap pulled tight across your chest with one hand while the other carries the water bucket. The cold at this hour has a physical density to it, a weight that presses against your face and pushes under your collar and finds, with unerring precision, every gap in your layering. Your ears ache. Your fingers, inside their wool wraps, are already stiff enough that gripping the bucket handle requires conscious effort rather than the automatic grip of warmer months. Firewood collection was the most continuous and physically demanding of winter labor obligations, and its management defined much of the rhythm of the cold season for poor families. The woodpile that you assembled in autumn was never quite large enough, you knew this going in and you accepted it, which meant that throughout winter you were making ongoing trips to supplement your stored supply with whatever dead wood remained collectible from the common margins and hedgerows. These trips were not pleasant walks. They required carrying significant weight over ground that was either frozen into uneven ridges that twisted ankles or thawed into the kind of deep, clinging mud that pulled at your clogs with every step and added 10 pounds of effort to every stride. You carried what you could. You came back and stacked it and went again if time permitted. The care of animals through winter was a daily obligation that could not be deferred or abbreviated without real consequences. Your cow required hay, cut and dried in summer, stored in the small hay loft above the animal quarters or in a separate stack outside, in quantities that you had estimated in autumn and which were, like everything else in your winter stores, never quite as generous as you would have chosen. The calculation of how much hay your animals could be given each day without exhausting the supply before spring grass grew was a constant background problem, one that got harder as February extended and the hay supply dwindled and spring refused to arrive on any schedule that accommodated your needs. Underfeeding a cow through winter reduced her milk production and weakened her condition, making her more vulnerable to illness and reducing her value as a working animal in spring. Overfeeding her exhausted your hay supply and left you with nothing. The middle path was narrow and required daily attention. Snow clearing was a labor obligation that extended beyond your own property in many European communities of this era, formalized through manorial obligation or village custom into a collective responsibility. The main village paths and roads needed to be passable, for the movement of goods, for access to the church, for the functioning of whatever small market activity continued through winter. In areas under feudal or manorial obligation, peasants owed their lord a specified number of days of road labor per year, and in some regions this was specifically timed to winter clearing, a particularly resented imposition given that it pulled men away from their own survival work to maintain infrastructure that primarily served the movement of the lord's goods and traffic. The records of manorial courts across 18th century England and France include consistent complaints about road labor obligations, and consistent fines for those who failed to fulfill them, which suggests that compliance was imperfect and that the resentment was acted upon whenever people felt they could get away with it. Ice itself became a commodity and a worksite in the depths of winter, and the harvesting of river and pond ice for storage in ice houses was a form of winter labor that involved poor workers even as it primarily served wealthy consumers. Ice houses, insulated underground or semi-underground structures where large blocks of ice were packed in straw and preserved through summer, were features of wealthy estates, and the labor of cutting and transporting the ice came from hired poor workers who were paid in cash or, more often, in kind. It was cold, wet, dangerous work. Falling through ice during cutting operations was a real risk, but it was paid work in a season when paid work was scarce, and families who could send an able-bodied member to ice cutting work were meaningfully better off for it. There is a genuinely interesting quirk in the historical record here. In particularly severe winters when the major European rivers froze solid, frost fairs sprang up on the ice, temporary markets and entertainment venues that operated on the frozen surface of the Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, and various German rivers. These events, which historians have documented in considerable detail, involved both wealthy visitors seeking novelty and poor workers seizing an unexpected economic opportunity, selling food, carrying goods, performing services on the frozen surface. The last Great Thames Frost Fair occurred in 1814, but multiple events in the 1700s brought hundreds of workers onto the ice for days at a time, a strange inversion of seasonal norms that turned a threat into a temporary marketplace. Historians still argue about the net economic effect of winter on poor rural households, whether the reduction in agricultural labor was offset by winter crafts and supplementary labor, or whether winter represented a genuine net loss of income that accumulated into the debt spirals many poor families carried from year to year. The evidence suggests that the balance varied enormously by household composition, location, and access to supplementary work, but that the labor of winter was real, relentless, and never optional. Someone in your household is sick. It may be the youngest child, running the low persistent fever that has been present for 3 days now and shows no particular sign of resolving itself. It may be your partner, whose cough began as the dry rasp of cold air in an irritated throat and has deepened over the past week into something wetter and more concerning, something that wakes them in the night and leaves them pale and exhausted by morning. It may even be you, the ache behind your eyes, the heaviness in your limbs that you have been attributing to fatigue and cold and the general physical punishment of winter labor but which has begun to feel, this morning, like something more specific and more worrying. Whoever it is, illness has entered your household, and you are going to deal with it the way you deal with everything in this winter, with what you have, with what you know, and with the quiet, practical courage of someone who has no other options. The medical landscape available to the rural poor of 18th century Europe was a layered and genuinely fascinating mixture of empirical folk knowledge, herbal medicine of varying effectiveness, religious practice, and outright magical thinking, all of it operating in the complete absence of the germ theory of disease, the understanding of viral infection, or any of the other conceptual frameworks that make modern medicine possible. Your village almost certainly had no physician. Physicians were expensive urban professionals whose fees were beyond anything your household could contemplate. What your village had was a variety of informal and semi-formal healers whose services occupied the space between practical nursing and something closer to ritual, the wise woman or cunning man who knew the local herbs and their applications, the midwife who handled not just births but a broad range of women's and children's ailments, the blacksmith in some communities who also pulled teeth, and always, overarching everything, the priest who offered spiritual remedies for physical suffering and whose prayers were considered a legitimate component of treatment. The herbal medicine available to your household was not uniformly useless, and this point matters because there is a tendency in popular history to dismiss pre-modern folk medicine as pure superstition. Some of it was. A significant portion of it was not. The herbs that were grown in cottage gardens or gathered from hedgerows and common land across 18th century Europe included a number of plants whose active compounds have since been identified and confirmed by modern pharmacology. Willow bark, which was used for fever and pain across many European folk traditions, contained salicin, the chemical precursor to aspirin. Elderberry preparations used for respiratory illness contain compounds that genuinely show antiviral properties in laboratory conditions. Garlic, used almost universally across European folk medicine as an antimicrobial, contains allicin, which has documented antibacterial effects. You did not know why these things worked. You knew that they worked, or that your mother said they worked, or that the wise woman said they worked, and in the absence of alternatives this was sufficient evidence. For the fever that your child is running, you would apply a combination of approaches. Cooling compresses, cloth soaked in cold water and applied to the forehead and wrists, to bring the temperature down physically. A preparation of elderflower tea, perhaps with a little honey if you had any remaining from the summer, which was a standard childhood fever remedy across most of northern and central Europe and which had the genuine virtue of encouraging fluid intake in a patient who needed hydration. Extra warmth, counterintuitively to modern understanding but in keeping with the prevailing medical theory of the era, which held that fevers needed to be sweated out, the child bundled and kept near the fire, encouraged to sweat, the sweat seen as the illness leaving the body. Modern medicine has complicated our view of fever management significantly, but the practice of keeping a sick child warm and hydrated was not without benefit in a cold cottage in February. The cough that worries you more than the fever was addressed with preparations that ranged from the genuinely helpful to the purely hopeful. Thyme tea, which had expectorant properties that were empirically observed over centuries before they were chemically explained. Preparations of horehound, a bitter herb used as a cough remedy across Europe and subsequently validated enough that it appears in commercial cough preparations into the modern era. Onion syrup, sliced onions layered with honey or sugar and allowed to macerate overnight into a thick liquid that was given by the spoonful, which appears in folk medicine records from France, Germany, England, and Poland with such consistency that it clearly worked well enough to be retained across generations and cultures. Poultices of heated cloth or warmed animal fat applied to the chest, which provided comforting warmth even if the therapeutic claims attached to them were optimistic. The quirky footnote to all of this is that some of the stranger remedies in the 18th century European folk pharmacopoeia were stranger than they sound on the surface. Carrying a potato in your pocket to ward off rheumatism was a persistent belief across parts of England and Ireland. Rubbing a sty with the tail of a black cat was considered effective in several regional traditions. Spider webs applied to wounds appear in folk medicine records from multiple European countries, and while the practice sounds alarming, spiders' webs do contain vitamin K and have some hemostatic properties. The folk observation was not entirely without basis, even if the mechanism was completely misunderstood. Historians still argue about the net effectiveness of 18th-century European folk medicine compared to the alternatives available, whether the treatments provided by village healers produced better outcomes than untreated illness, and how the answer varied by condition, region, and practitioner. The emerging view in the history of medicine is that for common winter ailments, respiratory infections, mild fevers, digestive complaints, the herbal repertoire of the rural poor provided meaningful symptomatic relief even where it could not address underlying causes, and that the social and psychological dimensions of treatment, the healer's visit, the community's concern, the ritual of preparation and administration, had real effects on patient well-being that we would now classify under the broad heading of the placebo effect, which is not nothing. What you had, in the end, was attention. Careful, continuous, experienced attention to the sick person, combined with everything your knowledge and your resources could bring to bear. It was not enough, sometimes. In the depths of winter, with a weakened body and a cold cottage and limited food and no antibiotics, it was sometimes not enough. But it was what you had, and you gave it fully, and in most winters, for most illnesses, it was just barely sufficient. The fire has been banked for the night. You did this yourself, an hour ago, with the careful attention of someone performing a task that matters, raking the coals into a central pile, covering them with a thick layer of ash to slow the burn, checking once and then checking again that the arrangement would hold until morning without either dying completely or throwing a spark onto the floor rushes. The cottage is dim now, the only light a faint dull pulse from the covered embers and whatever thin gray illumination comes through the gap in the shutters from a moon that is doing its best behind a layer of cloud. The temperature inside has already begun its nightly drop, that slow, patient descent from the modest warmth of the evening fire toward the colder equilibrium of the small hours, when the insulation of walls and thatch and animal heat from the other side of the partition will be all that stands between your family and the serious cold outside. You are not sleeping alone. In the 18th century rural European poor household, solitary sleep was a luxury as remote and as irrelevant as a private dining room. The family slept together, in the most literal physical sense, bodies sharing the available warmth the way a cluster of animals shares it, by proximity and contact and the pooling of metabolic heat into a shared thermal environment that was meaningfully warmer than any individual sleeping body could generate alone. The sleeping surface was typically a straw mattress, a large cloth sack stuffed with dried straw or hay, sometimes mixed with dried bracken or heather in regions where these were available, placed on a wooden bed frame or directly on the raised platform of a sleeping loft. Multiple people shared this surface. Children were arranged between adults or in a pile of their own, the youngest tucked against a parent's body, the older children pressed together in a row that maximized contact and minimized the exposed surface area of any individual sleeper. The bedding over this arrangement, the blankets and coverings that trapped the pooled warmth, was every textile the household could spare from other uses. Wool blankets where they existed, repurposed cloaks and coats, grain sacks, the family's spare clothing laid flat over sleeping bodies in the way that modern people layer extra blankets in a cold room. The goal was to create a sleeping environment that functioned almost like a nest, an enclosed, insulated space where the warmth generated by multiple bodies accumulated rather than dissipating into the cold air of the cottage. In particularly cold spells, the family might sleep fully clothed, which reduced the thermal demand on the bedding by keeping the insulation layer closer to the body where it was most effective. The nighttime threats that required monitoring were real and specific, and they shaped the sleeping patterns of poor families in ways that departed significantly from the modern ideal of a single 8-hour sleep block. Research into pre-industrial sleeping patterns, most notably the work done on historical sleep in the late 20th century drawing on diaries, court records, and literary sources, has established that the standard sleep pattern across most of pre-industrial Europe was biphasic, 2 distinct sleep periods separated by an hour or more of wakefulness in the middle of the night. This first sleep and second sleep pattern, as it appears consistently in the historical record, was not a response to insomnia or disorder. It was the normal expectation, built into the language and the daily planning of people across social classes. For your household, this midnight waking period had practical content that gave it a purpose beyond simply the biological rhythm that produced it. Someone checked the fire, confirmed that the banked coals were still alive, added a small piece of fuel if the temperature in the room had dropped enough to warrant it, adjusted the ash covering if needed. Someone checked the animals, crossed to the partition, listened for the steady breathing of the cow, felt for warmth, confirmed that nothing had gone wrong in the night that required immediate attention. In households with infants, the midnight waking included feeding, settling, the attentive check of a small chest's rise and fall that parents in every era perform without quite deciding to. These were not interruptions of sleep. They were the scheduled maintenance of survival systems that could not be left unattended for a full 8 hours in the depths of winter. The darkness itself was a feature of winter nights that modern people with electric lighting genuinely cannot reconstruct from imagination. When your fire was banked and your shutters were closed, the darkness inside your cottage was complete, not the urban darkness of a room with light coming under the door, not the suburban darkness where your eyes eventually adjust to the ambient glow of the world outside, but an absolute, featureless, textureless black that your eyes made no progress against no matter how long you waited. You navigated this darkness by memory and by touch. You knew where the door was, where the animal partition was, where the children were sleeping, where the fire was, because you had lived in this space long enough that its geography was written in your body rather than requiring your eyes. Fire as a nighttime threat deserves explicit acknowledgement, because thatch fires were a genuine and recurring cause of household destruction in 18th-century rural Europe. A spark from a poorly banked hearth, carried by a draft to the dry interior surface of a thatch roof, could take hold with terrifying speed. The documentary record of rural communities throughout this period includes regular entries of houses lost to fire, and the consequent homelessness in winter was one of the worst disasters that could befall a poor family, not merely the loss of shelter but the loss of stored food, tools, clothing, everything that the household's survival was built around. Village communities responded to fires with the same mutual aid reflexes that addressed other crises, absorbing the burned-out family into neighboring households until something could be rebuilt, but the fear of fire in the night was rational and persistent. There is a charming footnote in the sleep history of this era. Records from several English and French rural communities describe the role of the village night watchman, whose duties included not only looking out for thieves and disturbances but specifically watching for the first signs of roof fires in the small hours, the telltale curl of smoke from a thatch that was smoldering rather than simply cold. In some villages this was a paid position. In others it rotated through households on a communal schedule, each family taking their turn at the watch in exchange for the protection of the whole. Even in sleep, the village was a mechanism. Even in the dark, the network held. The darkness has been with you for months now. Not just the darkness of nights, which are long enough, 14, 15 hours of black in the depths of December in Northern Europe, a duration that reshapes your entire relationship with time and activity and the human need for light. But the darkness of days too, the low gray sky that sits over everything from November onward like a lid pressed down on the world, the sun appearing briefly and at such a shallow angle that it provides almost no warmth and barely adequate light, skimming the horizon for a few hours before retreating again into the gray. You have not seen a properly bright day in weeks. You have not felt genuine sun warmth on your face since September. And while you would not describe yourself as suffering from this, you do not have the vocabulary or the conceptual framework to name what you are experiencing as a diagnosable condition. Something in your body and your mind has changed since the light went away, and it will not fully return until the light does. What you are experiencing, without knowing its name, is the psychological and physiological reality of seasonal darkness, and its effects on the human mind and body are well documented in the modern literature on seasonal affective disorder and circadian rhythm disruption. The reduction in daylight hours suppresses melatonin regulation, affects serotonin production, reduces energy levels, flattens mood, impairs concentration, and produces a generalized heaviness of spirit that is not depression in the clinical sense but occupies an adjacent territory. In a modern person, this manifests as the winter blues, as the feeling of dragging through January, as the particular grayness of February afternoons. In your cottage in 1700s Europe, it manifests as something you simply call the weight of winter, a felt reality that everyone around you shares and that your community has developed, over centuries, an elaborate set of cultural and spiritual technologies to address. The most important of these technologies was the calendar of feast days and festivals that punctuated the winter months with mandated celebration, communal gathering, and the specific kind of psychological relief that comes from collective joy in the context of shared hardship. The Christian liturgical calendar, as it was observed across 18th-century rural Europe, was densely populated with winter observances: St. Martin's Day in November, St. Nicholas in early December, Christmas and its 12-day celebration stretching to Epiphany in January, Candlemas in February, and the long approach to Easter through Lent and its release in spring. These were not merely religious observances, though they were that too. They were scheduled interruptions of the grinding sameness of winter, occasions that required special food, communal gathering, the suspension of ordinary labor, and the assertion, against all the evidence of the cold and the dark, that life contained something worth celebrating. Christmas, in particular, was the great psychological hinge of winter for poor families across Catholic and Protestant Europe alike, the moment when the year's longest nights were already behind you even if the coldest weeks were still ahead. The midwinter feast was older than Christianity in Europe. Its positioning at the winter solstice was deliberate and carried the weight of every pre-Christian festival that had ever been used to assert human defiance against the dark. You did not have a decorated tree in the modern sense, you did not have wrapped gifts or printed cards, but you had something real and valuable, the best food your household could provide, assembled from the same stores you had been carefully rationing, the pig's best cuts that you had been saving for exactly this day, candles burning when they were normally unlit, neighbors gathered in a space that was warmer for their bodies than it would have been for yours alone. The feast was not extravagant by any objective measure. It was extravagant relative to every other day of winter, and that relativity was what gave it its power. The folk customs and superstitions of winter in 18th-century Europe were numerous and regional and endlessly varied, but they shared a common psychological function. They gave the community a sense of agency over a season that was otherwise experienced entirely as something that happened to you rather than something you participated in. If you performed the right rituals, the winter would be shorter. If you left the right offerings, the spring would come sooner. If you marked the right days with the right observances, the forces that governed cold and darkness and the death of the growing world would be propitiated and would eventually relent. None of this was literally true, and at some level most people knew it was not literally true, but it was psychologically true in the sense that doing something, anything, about your situation is genuinely better for the human mind than doing nothing, and the rituals of winter kept the community doing something together through the months when passive endurance was the only other option. The long winter evenings, which might have been experienced as empty and oppressive, were filled by the social institution of the Veillée in France, the Spinstube in the Germanic regions, and various equivalents across northern Europe, gatherings in the warmest available space, usually the home of whoever had the most fuel or the largest hearth, where neighbors came together in the evenings to share warmth and work and company. Spinning, knitting, mending, tool repair, practical work that could be done by firelight and that benefited from multiple pairs of hands. But also stories, songs, gossip, the oral transmission of local history and folk knowledge that was the primary media environment of the pre-literate poor. These gatherings were the winter social life, its entertainment, its therapy, its school, all of it happening simultaneously in a smoky room full of people who needed each other's company as much as they needed each other's warmth. Historians still argue about the degree to which seasonal mental health decline among the rural poor in this era was a significant driver of winter mortality, whether the psychological weight of winter contributed to susceptibility to illness, to accidents, to the failure of will that sometimes preceded physical collapse. The question is genuinely difficult to answer from the historical record, which documented outcomes rather than mental states. What is clear is that communities understood the psychological danger of winter isolation and responded to it with cultural practices designed specifically to counteract it: the feast days, the evening gatherings, the rituals of collective celebration that insisted, season after season, that the darkness was not permanent and that spring was always, eventually, coming. There were years when everything failed at once. You need to understand this, not as a dramatic narrative device but as a historical reality that recurred with enough frequency to shape the entire psychological landscape of rural poverty in 18th-century Europe. The individual strategies we have been following through this winter, the careful fire, the ration stores, the community networks, the folk remedies, the winter rituals, all of these were designed for the normal bad year, the year where winter was hard but manageable, where the harvest had been adequate if not generous, where the cold was serious but not catastrophic. They were not designed for the years when the harvest failed entirely, when the cold arrived early and stayed late, when disease swept through the livestock and the community simultaneously, when the Lord's tax collector came anyway despite everything, when the war moved through and took what was left. Those years existed. They came with terrible regularity. And what happened in them was different in kind, not just degree, from the ordinary winter struggle we have been describing. The 18th century in Europe was punctuated by a series of subsistence crises, episodes of mass food shortage driven by combinations of harvest failure, extreme weather, war, and the structural vulnerabilities of an agricultural economy with no storage capacity beyond the household and village level and no distribution infrastructure capable of moving food surpluses from regions of abundance to regions of need quickly enough to matter. The crisis of 1709 and 1710, triggered by the Great Frost, the most extreme winter in European recorded history, during which temperatures dropped so catastrophically that the sea froze off the coast of France, olive trees died across the Mediterranean, and grain stores across northern Europe were destroyed by cold that penetrated even well-maintained cellars, killed hundreds of thousands of people across France, the Low Countries, and Central Europe. The famines of the 1740s in France and Ireland, the crisis years of the 1770s and 1780s that helped create the conditions for the French Revolution, these were not isolated disasters but recurring features of a system perpetually operating at the edge of its capacity. In those years, the first thing that changed was the food. The rationing that you had been maintaining with careful precision through a normal winter became, in a crisis year, something more desperate, not the disciplined reduction of portions to make adequate stores last, but the genuine exhaustion of stores that were simply not there, followed by the turn to emergency foods that occupied the boundary between sustenance and poison. Bark bread, flour made from the inner bark of pine or birch trees, ground and mixed with whatever grain remained, was consumed across Scandinavia and parts of northern Germany and Poland in severe scarcity years, providing bulk and some calories but causing digestive damage with extended use. Clay was sometimes mixed into bread dough to add weight and the physical sensation of fullness while providing no nutritional value. Grain that had gone moldy in damaged stores was eaten anyway, and ergot, the fungal contamination of rye that produced a compound chemically related to LSD, caused epidemic outbreaks of ergotism, a condition whose symptoms included hallucinations, convulsions, and the horrifying gangrenous destruction of extremities that gave it the medieval name St. Anthony's fire. The social fabric that held communities together through normal bad winters began to fray under the pressure of genuine scarcity in ways that are deeply uncomfortable to read about. The mutual aid networks that we described earlier depended on reciprocity, on the understanding that giving now meant receiving later, that the community's collective survival capacity was worth investing in because you would need it yourself. But in a year when everyone was simultaneously desperate, the mathematics of reciprocity broke down. Giving food to a neighbor when your own children were hungry was not a sustainable social obligation, and the historical record of crisis years includes consistent documentation of the breakdown of community solidarity, the hoarding of food, the refusal to share, the emergence of black markets in basic necessities, the increase in theft and violent crime as desperation overrode the social constraints that normally governed behavior. Begging became mass migration in crisis years. The roads of 18th-century France in the winter of 1709 to 1710, and again in the terrible years of the 1780s, were filled with people who had left their home villages because there was nothing left there, families walking toward towns and cities where charity institutions might provide something, individuals heading toward regions rumored to have food, the desperate movement of people for whom staying put had become equivalent to dying in place. The urban authorities of the major European cities, Paris, London, Amsterdam, Hamburg, responded to these influxes with a mixture of charity and repression, opening emergency feeding stations and simultaneously issuing orders to drive vagrants back to their parishes of origin, an instruction that was both morally incoherent and logistically impossible to enforce against people who had nothing to lose. The authorities' response to subsistence crises in this era was shaped by a theory of poverty that held the poor largely responsible for their own destitution, the idea that idleness and improvidence were the primary causes of poverty, rather than structural features of an agricultural economy with no social safety net. This view was not universal. There were reformers and philosophers who argued differently, but it dominated policy in most European states through most of the 18th century and meant that institutional responses to crisis were systematically inadequate relative to the scale of need. Poor relief systems designed for the management of chronic individual poverty were simply not scaled for mass subsistence crisis, and the gap between need and response was filled by death. Historians still argue about the precise mortality figures for the major 18th-century European subsistence crises, partly because record-keeping in the worst-affected rural areas was itself disrupted by the crises, and partly because distinguishing famine mortality from disease mortality in populations weakened by hunger is genuinely difficult. What is not in dispute is the scale: hundreds of thousands dead in the worst episodes, whole villages depopulated, the demographic record showing the sharp teeth of crisis years as sudden notches in otherwise slowly rising population curves. You lived with the knowledge of these years. They were in the memory of your community, named and dated: the year of the Great Cold, the year the harvest failed twice in a row, the year the soldiers came through, carried forward as warnings and as the explanation for practices that might otherwise seem excessive in their caution. The root cellar dug deeper than strictly necessary. The hay stored beyond what the animals required. The neighbor helped even when it hurt. All of it in conversation with the memory of when it had not been enough. Something is different this morning. You notice it before you are fully awake, in that soft suspended moment between sleep and consciousness where the body registers the world before the mind has fully engaged with it. It is not dramatic, there is no sudden warmth, no burst of light through the shutters, no birdsong announcing transformation. It is subtler than that, and in some ways more powerful for its subtlety. The quality of the cold has changed. The hard, brittle, bone-dry cold of deep winter, the cold that crackled and bit and had an edge to it like metal, has softened overnight into something damper and less aggressive. The air that comes through the gap under the door is still cold, but it is cold in a different register, the cold of something releasing rather than the cold of something tightening. You have felt this before, every year of your life, and your body knows what it means before your mind catches up. The grip is loosening. Somewhere, at some distance still, spring is beginning its approach. It is March, probably. Perhaps late February in a mild year, perhaps not until early April in a hard one. The calendar matters less than the physical evidence accumulating around you, the slightly longer afternoons that you have been tracking with the unconscious precision of someone whose entire life is organized around the angle of light, the patches of south-facing ground where the snow has pulled back to reveal the dark earth beneath, the restlessness in the animals that suggests something hormonal and ancient is being triggered in them by signals you cannot quite perceive but they clearly can. The cow has been different for 3 days. The chickens have been louder. Even the pig, if you still have one, perhaps you do, if the autumn slaughter was generous and left a small one through the winter, seems to be responding to something in the air that smells, very faintly but unmistakably, like the end of the hard time. The emotional reality of surviving a winter in 1700s rural Europe was not something that the people who did it typically wrote about, because most of them could not write, and those who could were occupied with the practical demands of the season rather than its emotional texture. But it surfaces in the historical record in other ways, in the intensity of spring festivals, in the language of parish records noting the relief of communities emerging from difficult winters, in the folk songs and sayings that attached specific emotional significance to the first signs of thaw. There was a feeling, real and widespread, that surviving winter was an achievement that deserved acknowledgement. Not pride exactly, the vocabulary of individual achievement did not quite apply to something that was fundamentally a collective survival, but something closer to gratitude, collective and private simultaneously, directed at the community, at the animals, at the stores that had lasted, at whatever spiritual forces the community held responsible for the continuation of life. The practical work of spring's approach began before spring actually arrived, because the transition from winter to the growing season was itself a period of acute labor and careful management. The animals that had been wintered on reduced rations needed to be reintroduced to grazing carefully. Grass that looked green and inviting in early spring was often low in the nutrients that animals needed, and livestock turned out too early onto spring pasture sometimes collapsed from what was called grass staggers, a magnesium deficiency that modern veterinary science has explained but that you understood only as a danger to be navigated through careful observation and the accumulated wisdom of people who had made this transition before you. The fields needed assessing, which ones had survived the winter in condition for planting, which ones had suffered frost damage or waterlogging that required remediation before seed could go in, which ones needed the manure that had been accumulating through winter in the animal quarters and that was now, finally, ready to do the work you had been saving it for. The stores that had carried you through winter were nearly exhausted, and this near exhaustion was a feature rather than a bug of good household management. Having nothing left at the end of winter meant you had neither over-provisioned, which was expensive, nor under-provisioned, which was dangerous. But it also meant that the weeks between the last of your stored food and the first of the new season's production were a genuine gap, a hungry bridge between one year's harvest and the next that communities throughout Europe called the hungry gap or the lean weeks, and that required its own strategies. Wild greens, the first nettles and dandelions and hawthorn leaves of early spring, were harvested and eaten with an enthusiasm that was partly driven by their genuine palatability after months of stored food and partly by the body's recognition of fresh micronutrients it had been without. The return of eggs as the days lengthened and the hens came back into full laying was greeted with something that was not quite celebration but was adjacent to it. The first egg of spring had a significance that went beyond its caloric value into something more symbolic. Historians studying the demography of 18th-century rural Europe have noted that the spring mortality peak, a secondary spike in deaths occurring in March and April, following the winter mortality peak, was driven partly by the accumulated physiological stress of winter finally reaching its endpoint in bodies that had been managing on reduced resources for months. People who had held on through the worst of the cold sometimes did not make it to the warmth, their bodies depleted past the point of recovery by the cumulative demands of the season. This is a sobering footnote to the survival narrative, a reminder that making it to spring was not a guarantee of making it through spring, and that the boundary between the hard season and the good one was not as clean as the emotional logic of seasonal transition suggested. But you are still here. Your fire is still alive. Your children slept through the night and this morning the youngest one, who has been fretful and pale through the worst weeks of February, is sitting up in the loft and looking at the thin line of light coming through the shutter gap with an expression of uncomplicated interest that you have not seen on that small face in longer than you want to calculate. The cow is warm against her side of the partition. The hay is low but not gone. The root cellar has a few turnips left and a heel of salt pork that you have been conserving with the focused devotion of someone who understands exactly what it represents. You have made it. Not easily, not without cost, not without the ongoing renegotiation of every resource and every relationship and every expectation that winter demands. But you have made it, and the air through the door gap smells like loosening, and somewhere under the frozen ground the first green things are already deciding to begin.